If you can't respond to it or don't respond to it, in my opinion, you're not entitled to be taken seriously.
Yeah, you're just a fraud.
Yeah, fine. You're just a fraud.
Mm-hmm.
We agree. So,
what is happening here? Is she really a flat earther too? She's like, yep, I'm a fraud. Exactly, Norman says. You're just a fraud. I'm glad that we agree. He just called her that, right? Kind of weird because Noam Chomsky is Norman Finkelstein's spiritual father. To see someone like Norman Finkelstein and Candace Owens in agreement, it's like horseshoe theory confirmed, baby. Israel is uniting the world. It doesn't matter what other cultural contradictions exist between the likes of Candace Owens and Norman Finkelstein. All of that subsides because of this one genocidal, clearly amoralistic, reprehensible, savage, cruel, merciless ethno-state. We know Candace is ultimately a limited hangout, whereas Norman Finkelstein is an unlimited. She's still selling shit, so I muted her. Candace Owens is a black-white supremacist. Norman Finkelstein's an actual intellectual, you know?
I want to talk to you about the Holocaust, and please allow me to be offensive, as I've been learning a lot about the Holocaust and why it is such a precious area where you are not allowed. There's no incursion. There's no, you can't ask a question. You can't even.
Precious is a good word.
I said, you know what? I think
describe that.
It was 5 million. Forget it. I mean, it is very precious and protected. And as I've sort of began reading more books, I do have a theory, and you may be offended by this theory, you can push back on it. But particularly, I felt even more confirmed in this theory. Are you familiar with Nicholas Gruner?
No.
Okay, so Nicholas Gruner was an actual Auschwitz camp survivor. He was on the march, same march as your parents were on.
My father.
Yeah, your father was on, and he wrote a book in Yiddish about his experiences.
Yiddish?
I'm sorry, his friend who was with him on this walk, who he wanted to reunite, wrote this book.
Is Giddish. I'm still getting over gibberish Yiddish. I thought that was Giddish.
And when he found out that his friend had wrote this book and it had been translated into English, he went to go meet him, right? And it was like, I'm going to be reunited with somebody that was in this camp with me. He gets up to shaking this person's hand, and he's like, you've taken on the identity. You're not the real survivor. That person whose hand he shook was Elie Wiesel. You might be familiar with him because he wrote the book Night, and it was proven that he lied about certain parts of it. Nobody knew why, what this was.
Emphasis on weasel.
And so he then spent the rest of his life, Nicholas Gruner, dedicated to telling people that this man was effectively a gypsy who stole the identity of a real person. And he said, Nicholas rolled up his sleeve. He's like, we all have tattoos. He's not going to have one because he's not the real guy. This guy took his identity. Well, it turns out that Elie Wiesel was a cousin to Robert Maxwell, right? Fascinating, right?
No way.
Absolutely fascinating. Robert Maxwell wrote about it in his own book, his authorized biography. And we know Robert Maxwell, obviously, who everything about there is to know about him. And I was fascinated by this idea that there were people who were stealing the identity, whether dead or alive, of people who had actually been in the Auschwitz camps, building on their stories in whatever way. And it's sad that nobody knows Nicholas Gruner's name. People should know his name because it was a valiant fight. And he, to the very end, said, there are people who are stealing our identities. And I go, I've got this feeling that happened a lot more than we think it happened. This is one guy. And by the way, Robert Maxwell then purchased a massive stake early on in McGraw Publishing, McGraw-Hill, which means that, and then his wife was traveling around with Elie Wiesel. And this guy was like, this was not prisoner number, whatever it was. He took his identity. And that's a really terrifying thing to think about, that people with power saw, okay, these people were in camps. Maybe they perished. We can take their identities, take their stories, whatever it is. He never found out what happened to his friend. He assumes he died sometime after the camp. And he did write, it was his friend who wrote the manuscript in Yiddish, and then Elie Wiesel adopted that.
I mean, this doesn't seem like too far-fetched when it comes to Israelis, because we know for sure that they have invented people that don't exist, that they write off as victims, or they write off as in these airstrikes that they conduct against Gaza.
And now we have today, as you determine, a Holocaust industry. I'd like you to describe that, but just what I'm telling you, I mean, isn't that just the most terrifying thing ever?
We don't really know each other, and we're having a serious conversation now, and we should try to parse it, analyze it carefully.
Yeah.
Let me give you, as I understand it, the situation, not just from family history, but from having read quite a lot in the subject at a certain point in my life, having read quite a lot, I would say almost obsessively because of my family history, and having written on aspects of it. The estimates are there was an extermination campaign by the Nazis. We don't know. Two main questions remain open. The two questions that remain open are when. When did it begin? That still is an ambiguous area. When did this Nazi extermination camp actually begin? Nazi extermination plan. And we still don't know with any kind of certainty why. What was Hitler's exact motive at that point? So the when and the why, they remain gray areas. Now, I have to be, for people who are listening, I have to be careful. I stopped reading about the subject about 20 years ago. So there may be new scholarship which supersedes what I have just said. But that's it. Here are the two crucial facts. One, I don't consider it crucial. The estimates by the best historians are between 5.2 and 5.4 million Jews were killed. It doesn't make much of a difference. Let's say it wasn't, but let's say it was 3 million. That doesn't make it better, obviously. Okay, but the estimates are between 5.2 and 5.4. Now, coming to your question. The Nazi extermination was very efficient. You can use a slur and say it was done with German efficiency. And to some extent, there's a truth to that. You know, what makes a cliche is it's most of the time true. What is a generalization? A generalization is something that's generally true. What's a stereotype? A stereotype is a generalization that you don't like. If you say Jews are smart, Jews like that generalization. If you say something else about Jews, that's a stereotype. But the Germans carried out the Nazi extermination with great efficiency. Why is that important? There were very few survivors. Now, Candace, I'm not trying to, I don't have an axe to grind. I'm just telling you factually. You take my mother. She had 2 sisters and a brother. They were exterminated. She had a mother and father. They were exterminated. My father, I don't know the details, but I know for sure he had 1 sister and 1 brother. These are taboo subjects in my home. Can't talk about them. So I don't know the details. But I know they were wiped out. One of the reasons I wasn't bar mitzvahed, I did not have a bar mitzvah. And do you know why? I mean, there are many reasons. My parents were resolute atheists. But one of the reasons was there was no one to invite. You see, a bar mitzvah is a big family event. The cousins, the aunts, the uncles, and so forth. Of course, the person being bar mitzvahed invites his or her friends. Well, it's his friends, the person being bar mitzvahed or bat mitzvahed. But the big thing, it's a family occasion. There was no one to invite. There was no one to invite because the Nazi extermination was very efficient. So the estimates are, at the end of World War II, the estimates are less than 100,000 Jews survived the Nazi Holocaust. Less than 100,000. That means, where did all these survivors come from? Everybody claims there was a period when the Holocaust industry was very lucrative. There was a period where everybody claimed to be a Holocaust survivor.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, they all claimed to be Holocaust survivors. They weren't Holocaust survivors. There was a person who...
I actually think they were, but I fear they were survivors of another Holocaust that was going on at the same time, and they may have been, in part, executing it, which is a question that Alexander Solzhenitsyn writes, which is, where did all the Bolsheviks go?
Oh my God, dude. She's quoting Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the fiction writer of Gulag Archipelago. I can't. Here she's just spewing out CIA propaganda.
And I think, and this is again a theory, while we're allowed to think, well, this is a good opportunity right now to take on the identity of people who perished and just rewrite history of ourselves as the victims. And when I saw that Nicholas Gruner story,
please, Norm, push back on the Solzhenitsyn reference.
I was like, that's so terrifying because it's required reading coming up in schools. You have to read the story. There's tons of Holocaust people that we could be reading your books, talking about your parents and what they lived through, and they picked this man. And
I will get to the Elie Wiesel. I know it well. In fact, I'm not trying to promote the book. It came out 25 years ago, but I write a lot about Elie Wiesel in the book, okay? So I remember my father, we both knew a person who had the tattoo. The only place there were tattoos were Auschwitz.
Auschwitz, yeah.
It was the only camp where they had the tattoos.
The tattoos.
And I said
as opposed to tutus, which is what I'm wearing right now.
My father about this person, and my father had a tattoo. I always knew the number. It was like 028128, something like that. I had memorized the number, but now I've forgotten it. I said to my father, I said, do you think he was in Auschwitz? And my father said, no. And my father was not a conspiracy person.
Yeah.
No, he just said very matter-of-factly, non-judgmentally. He just said no. And I said to my father, I asked my father, so where did he get the number? And my father said, and I'm quoting him now, he said, well, after the war, some people took it off and some people put it on. But he didn't say it as a joke.
Yeah, he's just like, this is, the incentive here is to have one.
Yes,
it's bad.
yes.
It's incentives. It's incentive culture, obviously. They talk about this welfareism. If you're going to incentive bad
Mm-hmm.
behavior, people are going to do it.
Welfareism. You're going to incentivize bad behavior, so therefore that's welfareism. But remember that there's always a class ideology being promoted in every concept and every idea. And when she uses a phrase like she just did, incentivizing bad behavior, and call it welfareism, she's not talking about corporate welfare. She's not talking about welfare for the 1%, which is the political economy that we live in. She's talking about welfare for poor people, the most marginalized, vulnerable social and ethnic groups in our society, of which she is a member of, statistically.
Yes. I without going into that because I was on tangent, but yes.
He's like, look, I don't want to oppose you because I think what you just said was ignorant and we could pick it apart, but I'm not going to go there. This is a nice conversation we're trying to have.
And my father said very matter-of-factly. So my mother used to get very frustrated because even more so than my father, she could never let go of what happened to her family. She couldn't let go. And there was something that really more than grated on her when people who didn't pass through what she passed through claimed to have passed through it. And she once exclaimed in a kind of bitter irony, she said, if everybody who claims to be a Holocaust survivor actually is one, who did Hitler kill? So everybody's claiming to be a Holocaust survivor. There are very few, a handful survive that ordeal. Now,
Especially particularly in Auschwitz, because there's so many were like, well, you said the tattoo.
There were the death camps, and then there were the concentration camp death camps. There were both work camps and Auschwitz and Majdanek. I once spoke to the world's leading authority in the Nazi Holocaust, Raoul Hilberg, who was very kind to me. He was of your political persuasion. He was a right-wing Republican. He swore by the Wall Street Journal. I was at the other end of the spectrum, and I was a total pariah. However, don't ask me why, because I've never really understood it. He kept defending me. I was always very nervous around him. I didn't want to say anything wrong because he was kind of my savior. He was saying that what Finkelstein is writing is true. And when the tenure battle erupted at DePaul University, he gave this very moving defense of me. And he said that I told the truth. It was at a very big price, he said. But he said, in the history of those writing about history, Finkelstein's place is secure. In any event, I once asked him, he lived in Vermont. He taught at the University of Vermont. He was very much his own person, so he could never get a job at a top university. He said, very few women survived Majdanek. That's where my mother was. Very few people. So it was worse, actually. The women's section was worse than at Auschwitz. In any event, once the Holocaust industry became an industry, they were very picky about who they promoted. Now, Elie Wiesel was a fanatical supporter of Israel. He was fanatically pro anything that any American government would say. And so he became the spokesperson for the Holocaust. As to his personal history, I'm just going to give you the details as I understand them, okay? He claims he was in Auschwitz. He claimed that he was in Auschwitz. And he describes in the book Night, he describes some scenes which Raoul Hilberg, the person I mentioned to you, from the person who defended me for reasons which still remain, except integrity, which is so rare. He was the chief historian for the Holocaust Memorial in Washington. Elie Wiesel personally picked him because Wiesel knew his stuff. And he said there were certain scenes that Wiesel describes in Night that occurred at Auschwitz, Hilberg said they could not have happened. They could not
Without
have
question, they
happened.
didn't happen. You
And
read Nicholas
so
Gruner, yeah. It's like,
when Wiesel was confronted with Hilberg saying they happened, he doubled down and said they did happen. Wiesel, I knew some, not many, I knew some first-rank Holocaust historians, and they told me he was deported in 1944 from Hungary. That was one of the last deportations from Hungary. And he maybe passed through Auschwitz en route to a labor camp. That may have happened, according to the people I talked to. But there was clearly, I discuss it at some length in that little book. Wiesel figures not in a cameo role, but he has a major, he's a star of the Holocaust industry.
Yeah, I'm glad that I put Nicholas Gruner on your radar because he just knew the guy. He literally stole his identity. I mean, it's a crazy.
I remember,
he knew him because obviously when you're in a camp together, and he was like just so excited to re-meet someone who had this experience with him and described the march, everything, and the soles of his feet, and he just was like, what he did was the real person wrote the manuscript, and this gypsy just took on his identity and. When he describes that moment of being on the plane, what am I going to say to him? Like, we haven't seen each other. And then, like, could you imagine being confronted and going, wait a second, you're not Norm Finkelstein. You're not Norm. That is, and he said, but he had cameras ready and they like shook hands. And then he even said, what's even crazier is the real Holocaust survivor spoke Hungarian.
Well, that is
and Elie couldn't speak Hungarian at this time when this happened. And so he says to him, let's speak in English. It's just an incredible thing to comprehend that. And I think the best that I can guess is that you had these psychopaths, like, true Bolshevik psychopaths who were like, well, we can't just walk in and be like, well, I was just kind of running the Bolshevik camp over here, mass murdering Christians. So what better way to reintroduce yourself into society than to be like, I'm the ultimate victim. I survived the Auschwitz camp. I think that's what happened. I think
I'm still so confused by some, people like Dan Bilzerian and Candace repeat this myth that the Bolsheviks also were guilty of a genocide and mass murdered Christians by the millions. Source?
They laundered they laundered through, and that's why there's so much confusion. And people are like, you're denying that people died here, because there's some people that are like, well, nothing ever happened, And it's like, no, something definitely. You read this guy Nicholas Gruner, and you're like, this happened. And there are some people who never lived a day in their lives of that. And I say Elie Wiesel is one of them, who took their personalities, took their identities. Full on gypsy.
I actually, regrettably, I read a lot on the Elie Wiesel case, and I tend to defer to
to the experts.
Hilberg's judgment. And I think the judgment that there were in his so-called memoir, there were fabricated scenes is correct. However, I also believe that, when you explore any concrete situation, there are going to be things that are inexplicable. You just can't explain how or why that happened. And you have to accept that in any historical reconstruction, there are going to be inexplicable, enigmatic phenomena. And I think in the case of the Nazi Holocaust, it's sort of like the Flat Earth Society. When you want to deny a certain phenomenon, of course, you have the right to deny it. That's as to deny a person the right to deny is what the great British philosopher John Stuart Mill called the presumption of infallibility, that you know the truth and nobody else can know the truth. No, we're fallible creatures. We're capable of error. And we always have to leave some corner of our mind open to the possibility that our deepest, most sacred beliefs, our foundational beliefs,
Could be wrong.
wrong.
Yeah.
Could be wrong. However, if you're like in the Flat Earth Society and you say the world is not round, in order to be credible, you have to respond to the mountain of evidence that's accumulated that shows the world is round.
Mm-hmm.
You have the right to say the earth is flat, but you
He's being like, he's tiptoeing, right? He's handling Candace right now with kid gloves.
also, if you're responsible, have to respond to a massive accumulation of evidence to the contrary.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't respond to it or don't respond to it, in my opinion, you're not entitled to be taken seriously.
Yeah, you're just a fraud.
Yeah, fine. You're just a fraud.
Mm-hmm.
We agree. So,
What is happening here? Is she really a flat earther too? She's like, yep, I'm a fraud. Exactly, Norman says. You're just a fraud. I'm glad that we agree. Thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe to the page to help it grow. And if you'd like to support my work, join my Patreon for exclusive content.